Welcome to the NBA slate breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo, taking a look at tonight's 7-game slate. Pretty kind of mellow 7-game Friday slate. Not a great slate of games. Most of these totals are under 210, couple under 205. So kind of an average slate. We'll be breaking down position by position here. We'll start with point guard. The guard spot is certainly an area of kind of a lot of pay up, a lot of usage options up top. When we kind of look at point guard, John Wall is obviously going to be a guy who, when you look at the salary, I mean, he's going to be a guy I think a lot of people are going to be looking to try and plug and play. I don't think he's a core play here tonight, but I think he's a guy you can get some exposure to. We look at Detroit. They're a team where the last 10 games, they do rank 29th in defensive efficiency against the position. We just saw Washington come out of just a horrific game against Charlotte where they got blown out. Wall still managed to put up 30 fantasy points in that outing. He's averaged 51 over his last 5 games. Last time out against Detroit, Wall put up 26, 10, and 3. Wall could easily become the top scoring point guard on the slate. But then again, I mean, when you kind of look over at shooting guard as well, there are just a ton of primary kind of pay up options too. So, not necessarily a huge pay up spot at point guard, but when you kind of look at it, there's only a handful of options that you can kind of choose from, and Kyle Lowry's kind of the next one here, where once again, kind of not another must play here, but San Antonio's obviously still a solid defense against point guards, but not a defense that I'm kind of really looking to shy away from. Obviously, their best defensive player, is out right now in Kawhi Leonard. I know Danny Green's a capable defender, but their guards really not so much. Lowry back-to-back 30-plus fantasy point outings since returning from the injury. His usual minutes have been there. Has averaged 19, 4, and 4 over his last 5 games against San Antonio. They've been relatively similar teams in that span. Don't mind Lowry. People will overlook him tonight just because it's Kyle Lowry and he just hasn't really been used this year. But, I mean, the guy has 1.08 fantasy points per minute this season, still averaging right around 35 fantasy points per game. Like, he's been solid this year, just been a little bit more inconsistent in comparison to maybe the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that's going to turn people off. And you look at Toronto, I mean, still a 106 implied total, still very solid. And obviously, you're going to expect a lot of production from that backcourt. So don't mind going with Lowry. He's playable in all formats for me. Once again, I think there is some upside in GPPs with him. One guy that I will be kind of extremely looking at, that's Goran Dragic. He's the one that I'm kind of taking the biggest step forward with. I did it last time against Milwaukee, and it did burn me, although granted my lineups were absolutely annihilated after Bell. I know people cashed. You could still cash with Bell, but Dragic and Bell was not getting me there. So I'm willing to go back to the well on Dragic. Mentioned it the last time out he played. He's right around a 30% usage rate over his last 10 games. Once again, with Waiters and Johnson out, this is a guy who's going to take a lot of the offensive shoulder a lot of the offensive work here in this game. Also a very favorable matchup against Brooklyn. You look at Dragic over his last 10 games, averaging 25 and 6, and that's even including the dud against Milwaukee. Has been right around 30 fantasy points his 2 meetings against Brooklyn. Minutes were kind of sparse in that one as well. So once again, don't mind going with Dragic here. I think he's playable once again in all formats. I'm willing to trust him here. Pretty fair price tag. He's 7,500 on both sites. It's just such a solid spot for him with a 105 implied total there. I think Miami's going to be a team you can definitely look to target tonight. We kind of get to some lesser options just in terms of the position. A lot of mid-range guys here tonight. Not too fond of Ish Smith. Not too fond of Spencer Dinwiddie in these spots. Dinwiddie you can take a flyer on in GPPs if you're building a ton of lineups, but it's just not a great spot here for point guards against Miami. It's a spot, I don't like targeting Miami. Still pretty good defensive team, not a fast-paced team, although obviously they'll play a little bit up just given the fact they are playing Brooklyn. But once again, it's just not a spot that I'm really looking to get a ton of exposure. If you're getting a lot of lineups in tonight, you can certainly look that way. I'm going to probably find myself more in the range of looking at, some cheaper shooting guards to kind of get my value here. But you can make the case for a couple of names here like Darren Collison, Corey Joseph, obviously both in very favorable spots against the Lakers. I think obviously it's just a matter of kind of what price difference you need. Joseph obviously going to be the cheaper guy. Joseph's going to be a guy who does get around 25 fantasy points. He is coming off a dud against Portland, but 25 and 29 fantasy points in prior games. I don't mind him. He does have a little bit lower floor. We've seen Collison kind of be a little bit more consistent of late. We saw Collison play really well last night, scored 23 points, only had 3 assists and 1 steal. But at his price tag in this matchup, I think you can definitely look at Collison as kind of a primary option down low. Outside of that, though, I know obviously like guys like Tyler Ulis is going to pop up. I don't mind him. He's playing minutes right around 30. I know he played 24 and 24 his last 2 games. But prior to that, I mean, three games over 30 minutes. Tyler Ulis is obviously an attractive option given the fact that this game is going to be extremely popular. Should be a ton of upside in this game, just given the fact it's Denver and Phoenix. It's, the highest total on the night at 218. Look at Phoenix has a 104 total, Denver 113. That's going to be a game that I do kind of focus on my fantasy lineups around here tonight. So definitely in play. Not really chasing the big Patty Mills game. Had 3 steals. He's a guy who could pick up a steal every now and then. He does have 20+ upside, but once again, it was against Brooklyn. Tougher matchup here against Toronto, especially with Lowry back. I don't think you necessarily need to dive down. And mentioning Tony Parker, he's another one. He's playing right around 25 minutes. Doesn't have a ton of upside. He kind of caps out right around 25 fantasy points. A little bit lower floor as well. I'm kind of finding the space for guys like Ulis, finding the space for guys like Collison and kind of going that route as well. It's a little bit different on DK, of course, because you have a couple guys who are, you have the Lakers guards who are point guard eligible, like Clarkson and Josh Hart, who, we'll talk about here in a minute. Those guys could obviously easily slide in over there for value. So I prefer them kind of over the names I've just mentioned. But as on FanDuel, it's a little bit more stricter, not really targeting the Jarrett Jackson, George Hills of the world tonight. So pretty limited point guard slate. I think you're obviously starting Wall, Lowry, Dragic up top. I think that's pretty clear. De'Aaron Fox is always an interesting GPP option. 22% usage rate over his last 10 games. Minutes have also been pretty solidified for him in this offense. It's an average spot against Utah. They're getting Rudy Gobert back tonight, probably in limited fashion. Not too worried here. Still willing to attack this game because it is 7 games, but I'm not looking to get a ton of exposure to that one as well. Sorry, I don't know why I mentioned Rudy Gobert. They're playing Memphis. With Memphis, it is a little bit of a tougher matchup. But like I said, Memphis has been average on defense of late. They have been struggling a bit this year, especially if Gasol is off the floor. It's not a great team at all, and I don't mind attacking them one bit. Move on to shooting guard here. This is a spot that is pretty loaded here tonight. We're looking at guys like Victor Oladipo, Tyreek Evans, Devin Booker, DeMar DeRozan, Donovan Mitchell. I mean, all these guys here, very much in play. I think Victor Oladipo is a guy you can certainly look to pay up for tonight. It's kind of hard not to, just given the fact it's got a great matchup against the Lakers. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is ruled out. He's a lengthy defender that can give some trouble to people, but Victor Oladipo has just once again been fantastic. 29% usage rate. Last 5 games, he's averaging 16 field goal attempts per game, 42 fantasy points per game. I know he's expensive, but I don't mind using some of these shooting guards that are on DraftKings and using them at point guard because I do think their ceilings are a little bit higher. Guys like Donovan Mitchell, guys like Victor Oladipo at point guard eligible. Don't be afraid to lock them into your point guard because guys like Will Barton, Gary Harris, Devin Booker can all be plugged in there again. These are all great options on tonight's slate. So to kind of break down each one, Oladipo, Lakers 23rd defensive efficiency against shooting guards last 10 games. This is obviously a spot where Oladipo can, show the upside. I'm not tremendously worried about the back-to-back here tonight. It is still a great spot. The total is still fairly high. Tyreek Evans. Tyreek Evans is interesting because one, he's kind of a spin-off of these names. I think Booker and Oladipo, even Mitchell, are going to draw a lot of usage or a lot of ownership here tonight. Where Evans is always kind of that guy you can look at. Sacramento's a bad backcourt defense. They haven't allowed a ton of fantasy points, but over the last 10 games, that's been creeping up more and more. They are bottom 5 against guards on fantasy points allowed over the last 10 games. Evans is obviously interesting given the fact that his usage rate. It's just been through the roof this season. We know the field goal attempts are going to be there. He's averaged 19 over his last 5 games, especially if Gasol sits again here tonight. That's going to be another spot where it just opens up Evans. Just the offense is just going to be flowing through left and right. But Gasol's a guy I kind of expect to play here. Probably should make his return given the fact that it was just an illness. Did set out the 17th, had a day off in between here, and he should be back. But Evans still very much in play. Devin Booker, obviously coming off a monster game and more so a monster fourth quarter against Portland, where I went to bed that night right around halftime of that game, and the Devin Booker lineups that went through, it was just like, woke up and was like, holy shit! It was out of control. This is the potential that Booker has here. He's going to be a guy who does jack up shots. Has been slightly better on the road this season just in terms of shooting. Obviously a little bit of a small sample size, obviously because he was banged up for a little bit and missed some time. It's only over 13 games on the road, 16 at home. But we know Booker's usage rate obviously through the roof. We've seen his peripheral stats kind of start to really pick up because he has been providing a little bit more of a ball handling role. I mean, 8 assists, 7 assists, 9 assists over his last 3 games. We're starting to get a much higher floor out of Booker where he doesn't, the thing with Booker is we've always kind of been like, he's got to score 30, 40 real points to provide a huge upside. But, we saw obviously the last game where he put up 43, but games before that, 27 fantasy points, 6 rebounds, 9 assists against Houston. This is a type of game where Booker can rack up some fantasy points. It's a good spot for him. He's going to be a guy that I do want some exposure to. So I think him and Oladipo are the 2 top guys at the shooting guard position. I do think DeRozan and Tyreek Evans are kind of interesting spins. DeMar DeRozan, I don't think that Toronto San Antonio game is going to get a ton of love because it's kind of 2 grinded out teams that when they come together, it doesn't create an appealing fantasy matchup, but he's viable on this slate. I think you're going to kind of jump down to Donovan Mitchell here, who's in a fairly good spot against the Knicks backcourt defense that shouldn't really give you any concern. He's averaged 23 real points over his last 10 games, 48% from the field, 29% usage rate, continues to score at will. He's a guy that I would like to see some peripheral stats pick up, but the steals over the last few games have definitely been encouraging, 3-2-2. Turnovers have been somewhat limited for him, which is nice, but would like to see a few more assists, would like to see a few more rebounds, but this Jazz team's obviously bad. Mitchell's basically been a one-man show at this point, him and Favors, and with Gobert back, it obviously takes Favors a little bit out, but Mitchell's kind of the main guy that I'm looking at from Utah, and that's going to be the case moving forward. I will say this, if Avery Bradley sits tonight, I think Bradley Beal's a much better spot. Definitely just a GPP option. He's cheaper exposure to this Washington side. I'm going to jump down and kind of quickly talk about Will Barton, Gary Harris, Jamal Murray out for tonight's game. Will Barton drew the start at point guard. That'll likely be the case again here. Great spot for Barton, even at increased prices. He's going to be a guy that I look at. Gary Harris is another one. You can count on them, both cash and GPPs. Just both are going to play 35 minutes against a Phoenix team that's, god-awful against both point guards and shooting guards. You can lock them safely into your lineups and feel pretty comfortable about it. And then we kind of drop down, we're looking at Kentavious Caldwell-Pope out. We're looking at Lonzo Ball out. Josh Hart's been a guy who's filled in for Ball and has done nicely. I know Tyler Ennis has drawn some starts, but Hart's been a guy who can get you around 20, 25 fantasy points at a fairly cheap price. Both of them are only shooting guard eligible over on FanDuel. It's a little bit of a different story because using one, you're passing up on some other options, but I think you can go one and then pay up at the other spot. DraftKings, of course, you have a lot more ways to go just given the multi-position eligibility. But these are both two guys I'm going to be looking for a ton of minutes in this spot. Clarkson's been kind of a dud with ball out, outside of maybe a few games. The last roll around he was out, but a decent spot here. Indiana's been pretty good defensively of late, but still a Lakers team that's going to rely on some guards that are going to have to play heavier minutes. I don't mind it. Both are cash and GPP viable. Both are extremely, extremely cheap on FanDuel. I think you're going to be looking to get some exposure there. DraftKings, they're in that mid 4 to 5K range. I know Clarkson's a little bit more expensive there. But Hart's a guy who's given you a solid floor when ball's out this year, so I don't mind going back to the well there. Outside of that, though, not a ton of interest in guys like Danny Green or Wayne Ellington or Courtney Alita Knight, Karis LeVert. Like, I'm not loving these Sacramento guys. Bogdanovich is interesting. He's just a little bit pricey, but I mean, he's earned it. He has 6,200 on FanDuel. I still kind of rather find some other options, but Memphis has been a team bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed over the last 10 games. I don't mind it. Bogdanovich has been a guy he's kind of quietly just been really consistent of late. So he's an option. Like I said, I think the price is a little bit higher than I really like, but I don't mind going there if you're building a lot of lineups. I do think he has a fairly safe floor in this spot. Small forward, probably one of the weakest positions on the slate. It's probably the weakest. Obviously, Kawhi Leonard out tonight. We're going to see Kyle Anderson fill in. Kyle Anderson is I don't like it. Just one, because he's not a great fantasy points per minute player. I know he's shown some upside that's kind of in the higher 20s, but once again, like, he's not that appealing of a play for me. He's just not really used in that offense. Look at his usage rate. I mean, it's low teens, fantasy points per minute rate around 0.85. It's not a good matchup against Toronto. I'm definitely willing to fade and go some other directions. There's kind of a lot of ugly fantasy points per minute guys down here. When you take a look at the Wilson Chandlers and the Lance Stevensons of the world, like, you're kind of looking and hoping that they get you in between 20 and 25 fantasy points. And on a slate like this, is certainly viable for you to look at. But I kind of just like sneaking up just a little bit and going with like a Josh Richardson, who once again over his last 5 games still averaging 29 fantasy points. It's not a bad spot here against Brooklyn. I think he's the highest upside guy of that group. Otto Porter has been a guy you want to like, because this slate just doesn't offer a ton of guys, but we haven't seen the upside really out of Porter. His biggest game came, against Houston a little less than a month ago. He's cheap. You can take a flyer on him just because this position's so weak. But TJ Warren's kind of where I'm going to be looking to kick things off tonight, because one, expected to be due back. I'm not too worried about the back injury. He's fairly cheap. The price has dropped down a little bit. We look at this Denver team. Not a lot of great defenders that he's going to have to deal with. Warren had a solid 36 fantasy point outing against Denver the last time these two teams met. Warren, obviously a guy that works well with Booker. He's going to be the guy that I'm kind of be looking to get a lot of exposure to out of this one. Him and Josh Richardson. I just don't have so much appeal for guys like Kyle Anderson and Wilson Chandler, but you can look to use them, and that's kind of about it. Michael Beasley, like, his role is always going to be fluctuating given the fact that Tim Hardaway Jr. is back. I don't mind going there in GPPs. He's not a cash game option. His Jazz defense is obviously still going to be a little bit better with Gobert back, but he's not going to be on the floor a whole lot. So Beasley is always a worthy look, just because he has such a huge usage on the floor. The guy that I am taking a look at here, and we talked a little bit about Dillon Brooks on Wednesday, and we talked about how Brooks has been a guy who has a hard time following up big games with another solid game. He did that against New York, the Lakers, and obviously the game before, 24 fantasy points, 27 fantasy points against New York. Still very, very cheap. He'd be the guy that I'd probably take as a true value at the small forward spot. He's below 4K on FanDuel. He's below 5K on DraftKings at a small forward position that doesn't have a lot to offer. It's obviously not a bad spot against Sacramento, who ranked 23rd against the position, are 19th in defensive efficiency. I think you can obviously go here. So once again, he's not a great fantasy points player, but at 4,200 on DK, 39 on FanDuel, like, he's a guy who can easily outscore Kyle Anderson. He can easily outscore Wilson Chandler. he's a guy who can come in close if Richardson only pops off at 30 and we get Brooks at 27 or so. Like, I'm not vouching for Brooks and going all in on Brooks, but like it just kind of makes sense to go him and take some savings and spend that extra 15 to 2K elsewhere. So once again, at a weak position, like it's not that appealing to kind of go with some of those mid-range guys that aren't great fantasy points per minute players. So let's move on to power forward. We'll talk kind of the two clear-cut options up top. LaMarcus Aldridge is going to be a guy who I think a lot of people will go with. With Kawhi out this season, he's averaged 24 and 8. The few games that Kawhi has been back, he's averaged 18 and 8. Clearly, you want the higher upside Aldridge at his prices. Look at this Toronto team. They've been pretty average against power forwards over the last 10 games. Aldridge, I think, still a pretty safe cash game floor. I think in terms of upside, I kind of want to look at Porzingis for a little bit more just because Porzingis' defensive stats have been absolutely through the roof. Multi-block games in each of the last 5. He has multi-steal games in 3 of the last 5. 6 blocks, 3 steals last time out, 2 blocks against Brooklyn, 2 blocks and 5 steals against New Orleans, 3 blocks, 2 steals against Minnesota. Like, you know, he's rebounding well. He seems to be kind of back in his groove. His shots are falling again. Even in this matchup, like Utah just doesn't have a defender. Like, you know, moving Favors over to the 4 and when Gobert's on the court, like it's still not going to be great. And when Favors goes to 5 and whenever backups are in, like Porzingis should eat this Utah front court with a somewhat limited Gobert tonight. So Porzingis is a guy I'm looking for that 50-plus fantasy point upside from. I know Utah's not the most obvious ideal matchup, but he's going to be a guy that I will get plenty of exposure to tonight. I do think you can kind of skip over the Rondae Hollis-Jeffersons, the Derek Favors. I think Tobias Harris and Domantas Sabonis are the 2 guys that I'm looking at the most here. Washington has been struggling against power forwards over the last 10 games. They're in 24th in defensive efficiency. Harris averaging 31 fantasy points per game over the last 5. Nice mid-range price for him. Detroit's played better at home. I expect this game to stay close. If this game was in Washington, I'd be a little bit more worried just because Detroit is severely banged up. And if they are missing a fair amount of guys like Bradley sitting, we could see them struggle just because they're struggling to field an entire 5 that's very confident. But Harris is certainly a viable option. Sabonis is another one, averaging 30 fantasy points over his last 5 with Miles Turner already ruled out. So this is a good spot. Sabonis is targeting a Lakers front court that does allow 7th most fantasy points to opposing centers this season. So Sabonis, a pretty clear-cut cash game option. You might be able to look elsewhere in GPPs because he hasn't flashed that upside, but this is also a pretty good matchup where I think he can get in that 35+ and maybe even narrow in on 40. Once again, not tremendously worried with the back-to-back of these Pacers. It is just kind of coastal travel, but nothing really to worry about. James Johnson, viable in all options for me tonight. Good matchup here against Brooklyn. They really do struggle against power forwards. If you're telling me James Johnson's going to get me 25 to 30 minutes against this Brooklyn team that does turn the ball over, plays a little bit fast, they're average on the glass, Johnson's a guy who can get you 30-plus fantasy points tonight at a fairly cheaper price. I just think he has a little bit more upside than guys like Lyles, guys like Ibaka. Randolph is in this spot where Randolph's interesting. If Scal's out tonight, I think Randolph is a little bit in play, but as we've kind of hinted on with the Kings situation, it's not appealing because they're going with they're resting veterans. They're going with some young guys. Zach Randolph, obviously not a young guy, is playing back in the grindhouse where he used to play. It was a blowout last time out against Utah. I could see him getting kind of 26, 27 minutes here in the spot if Scal's out. And once again, Memphis is not a good rebounding team. Front court defense has been a little bit off outside of Gasol, so I don't mind kind of going that route. And even on the other side, you can take a shot on JaMychal Green just because Sacramento is obviously not a great defense, and JaMychal Green has flashed some upside going that route. So Green's another one we can take a look at. We'll talk about the Lakers situation. This is going to be one where if Kyle Kuzma's out tonight, I feel pretty safe about Larry Nance and feel safer about Julius Randle. Julius Randle, obviously center eligible over on FanDuel. Both those guys would see solidified minutes, probably about 25+ there tonight. If Kuzma plays, still like Randle, don't like Nance as much. I'm not still big into Kuzma. Just given the fact that he is dealing with a finger issue. Obviously coming off a decent game against Memphis before leaving that OKC game. Uh, it is a good spot. I know Indiana's been better on defense, but they still lack defensive efficiency against opposing power forwards and centers this season. So I like this Lakers team here getting this Indiana defense that, yes, on paper over the last 10, they do look better, but still nothing that I'm afraid of targeting. So if Kuzma's out, feel free to use Nance. If Kuzma's in, becomes a riskier play. Not to say he can get you 20 to 25 fantasy points, but he could also dud out as well. Randall, I think, is still the safer option. Thaddeus Young has been better of late. I do think you can go to him here. It's not really chasing points if this guy's playing 35 plus minutes in 3 of the last 4 games, and he is a guy who does have some steal upsides. He does rebound well. I think Thaddeus Young is yet again another pacer you can use against an average to below average defense of the Lakers. So punt options, Dragon Bender because Marquise Chris is out, but I'm willing to fade that bullet once again. He scored 6 real points in his last 62 minutes. Has scored 18 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Not averaging together. I just think with Warren back here, I don't think Bender is going to have a huge ability in this offense against a good Denver rebounding team. I'm still not really opposed to using him, so I'm much more willing to fade Bender than I am to play him. If he gets 25, 30 fantasy points, I'll still trust that process of letting 30% of people just use him anyway, with far better options that aren't that more expensive on the slate. So that's kind of how I feel about Bender. Moving over to center here tonight. As far as the top end options go, we're obviously looking at Drummond and Jokic. Drummond's a viable GPP option. I think I still trust Jokic in cash games, especially in that matchup against Phoenix at a similar price, but you don't necessarily need to go and spend up there in cash games. I think at their prices, like there's still other ways to go. You go a little bit more balanced. Definitely prefer Jokic, but Drummond's obviously in a decent spot. We've seen Washington be pretty average against centers over the last 10 games, 17th in defensive efficiency. Drummond's averaged 42 fantasy points in 2 games against Washington. Would like to see a little bit more than that, obviously, at his prices, and he has that potential, but Washington's still a decent rebounding team. Gortat's going to be needed in there. So once again, I mean, Drummond, if he tops out at kind of 45, it's not great for his price. Jokic is the guy that I'm looking at. Suns bottom 8 in fantasy points allowed to opposing centers this season and over the last 10 games. Jokic averaged 45 over the last 5. Once again, he's the guy that we've seen just tremendous upside from. Going to be the guy that I'm looking at heavily. We saw that big upside game against Dallas. Really, I mean, his weakest game came against Memphis really over his last 5-6 games. So going back to the well there. Hassan Whiteside, once again, that was a great GPP call by Brent the other day against Milwaukee, coming off a monster 27-13 game with 6 blocks. Finally played over 31 minutes. It's the first time since coming back from injury. Good spot here against Brooklyn. I think you do have a little bit of worry about them going small and playing Whiteside off the court. I do think maybe we see minutes back down around the 25 range, but Whiteside's obviously a fantastic fantasy points per minute player. He's the best fantasy points per minute center on the slate at 1.37. Brooklyn, we know, struggle against centers. But once again, I'm a little bit worrisome with Whiteside. He's still going to be just a GPP option for me against Brooklyn. Earlier this season, he did have 33 fantasy points in just 20 minutes. But, we've just seen the risk of Whiteside getting played off in the 4th or getting benched in the 4th. And I think that's kind of what you can still look for here, even after one good game. Moving on, Willie Cauley-Stein. If Gasol is out, I don't mind him, although he still had a really good game against Memphis last time out on New Year's Eve. He put up 36 fantasy points. You can look to him in GPPs. He just continues to play out of his mind. I'm looking for some better matchups here, like a Julius Randle against that Indiana front court. I think you can go there. He's safe enough in cash and GPPs. We talked to Jonas Valanciunas the other day. I wasn't high on his upside, and he proved me wrong, but I did mention the fact that he plays well against Drummond in the past. Gortat's another one. Like some of these Eastern centers, and there's a couple of them that play well against Drummond, and it's Gortat, it's Valanciunas, and Robin Lopez are kind of the 3 that we've seen their minutes pick up, their fantasy production picks up, and Gortat's is one of those. Hasn't scored less than 20 fantasy points in his last 5 games against Detroit. Gortat was fine in that last game, but obviously 19 minutes in the blowout. Like, he had 17 points in that span. He's going to be needed out there. The minutes have been safer. He's been above 25 in each of the prior games since the new year. That was his first game, under 25, and obviously because of the blowout. So Gortat's been earning back his minutes. We've seen more upside out of him. We've seen a fairly safe floor. So I don't mind going back to Gortat as a cheap center, because I'm not going to the Mason Plumlees. I'm not going to the Tyson Chandler. I know Plumlee's coming off a solid game against the Clippers. You can take a shot in GPPs, but outside of that, like, we're not looking to anyone here. Gasol is a guy who, once again, GPPs you can take a look at. I just worry about his minutes. He's kind of another one in that same boat. And once again, it's not a great matchup against Toronto. So kind of limiting myself to the Drummond, Jokic, Whiteside, Randall, Gortat center options here tonight. So that's going to wrap it up. You can head over to dailyfantasycafe.com, check out cheat sheets. Our optimizer GPP picks article will be up a little bit later today. And we'll see you guys Monday.